Hey there, and welcome to That News You Care About, a weekly video game news show from the folks over at That Nerdy Site. Today is Monday, October 26, 2020, and I'm one of your hosts, Logan Wilkinson. Joining me this week is my Phoenix son, Trevor Starkey. How you doing, Trev?
I'm doing all right. I'm fired up. We had a rousing conversation before we started.
Be ready. This is going to be a
recording.
barn burner of an episode here, folks. All right. We're going to just jump right into it because me and Trevor are running hot off the presses here. As we were recording, I think actually last week.
It went live as we were recording Cam last week.
So as we were recording last week, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman from the Bronx, New York, launched her Twitch channel and started playing Among Us with, I know Pokimane, and then I don't know the other streamers that she was with.
There was I didn't recognize most of them. I mean, Dr. Lupo was in there. I recognized
Dr.
him.
Lupo was in. Okay, yeah.
Corpse joined at some point, and that became like a meme because he has a very low voice, and AOC had not really like encountered it before. Ilhan Omar was in there, fellow congresswoman.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to I just don't know the streamer scene.
We're not the streaming scene, but they all started Twitch streaming on Among Us, and it was a glorious sight to behold. I encourage everyone to go watch. I'm sure the archive is still up. Go watch it. It is a delight. And in the wake of that, it led to a number of articles and Twitter threads and just general kind of conversations that I enjoyed reading. About what it means for a United States Congress member to be on Twitch playing video games and just generally goofing off. It comes in lieu of AOC also being very prevalent on Instagram stories, for example, very active on Twitter as well, and just the increase in reality of future members of Congress being active on social media and understanding Twitch scenes and, dare I say it, being gamers. And in lieu of that, I thought it would be interesting and insightful to have a conversation on that, on the political nature of, first off, me and Trevor's generation, the millennial generation, and also the side of that of as members of our generation get into those positions of power, as they get into kind of the halls of Congress and, heaven forbid, the White House one day, and levers of the judicial system, what that could mean in terms of accessibility to people in position of power, accountability, and just having people who look like us, act like us, and even play games like us represent us as well. Trevor, I will open the floor up to you first. What were your initial thoughts on AOC playing Among Us, and then the larger conversation in the political sense?
Yeah, so after we wrapped up recording last week, I basically hopped in and checked out, a good chunk of that stream as it was going on, and it was really cool seeing 350,000 plus people in there. I think it capped out over
like 410, right?
430,000, I think, is one of the numbers I saw.
God, yeah.
Making it the third highest stream, behind one of them obviously was the Ninja and Drake stream, and I don't know what number 2 was, but it was also, I believe, the highest debut stream probably. It broke records, all that kind of stuff.
I'm sure, yeah.
And obviously Among Us is a very like in the moment kind of game, kind of out there like taking Twitch by storm. And it was just really cool to see this United States Congresswoman out there doing the same kind of stuff that I see my friends doing, that I see, What's Good Games or Kind of Funny out there streaming Among Us and that kind of stuff. And it absolutely immediately there's like an accessibility thing there. It is like, oh, I can much more relate to this kind of person. This is also like on the backs of the Biden campaign had released the Animal Crossing island.
Oh, right. Yeah. That's another great,
a few days earlier, which, obviously Joe Biden has nothing to do with, has probably never like seen or touched. But one of the things that, because, again, our friends over at Kind of Funny kind of hosted the reveal of that. And it became immediately apparent that whoever did make that island is like a super diehard Animal Crossing fan and knows Animal Crossing and is really good at, incorporating the tips and tricks of building Animal Crossing islands. I went and checked out the island myself, and yeah, it was a cool activation for a political campaign, even if Joe Biden has no idea what's going on there and any of that kind of stuff. It was still an interesting way to try and bring it in a way that's not like the obvious comparison that everybody made was like Pokemon Go to the polls. And I would argue there is a drastic difference between a political candidate that isn't really connected to that. Although I did find when I was doing research during the last election, footage of Hillary Clinton during the Bill Clinton years, Hillary playing like Game Boy on flights, on political flights and stuff like that. She'd be playing Tetris and stuff. So like she has a gamer past in her, but obviously like Pokemon Go to the polls became like a punchline kind of thing. I would argue that the Biden campaign tapping into Animal Crossing and trying to activate a portion of their audience through that is a drastically different approach to targeting a gamer audience. But certainly neither of those come anywhere close to AOC out there actually playing Among Us and engaging with a lot of these big name streamers and kind of tapping into their audience as well as her own, obviously, because that's the other thing is if you piece together the fact that like all of those other big streamers were streaming their own footage from their side of things, like that stream probably may have even surpassed the Ninja Drake stream in terms of overall numbers, but in terms of AOC's numbers in particular, they did reach that kind of cap. So the stream itself was obviously with 300,000 people in chat. There's no way to really engage with the chat in any kind of meaningful way. So it was much more her just kind of like in between games, talking to the chat, reminding them to vote. The whole thing was built around and targeted around the iwillvote.com initiatives, and really just trying to activate a whole bunch of people. And I think in a year where we're seeing record numbers of youth vote getting out there, and I think we're seeing record numbers of early voting, obviously with everything going on in the world, I think it was a perfect storm and couldn't have come at a better time in terms of just that particular like hitting the zeitgeist at the right moment with the right person. The fact, as you kind of mentioned, the fact that Representative Ocasio-Cortez has that social media savvy and following, and that audience made her very well suited for this kind of move in a way that I don't think anybody else currently serving probably would be able to really tap into.
Yeah, I think part of it for me too is I think the difference between Hillary and Biden, and I think there is an evolution there, and I think the Animal Crossing one was done more sophisticatedly, and I think having someone like Greg help kind of showcase it was a smart move on their end, and kind of an awareness of, I think, maybe earning that credibility among people within the community by having a Greg Miller type figure to kind of shepherd it. But even there, shifting that to then AOC herself streaming and Congressman Omar streaming, I think is such a next step because they're actively involved and like we know it is them, right? Whereas like Joe Biden, I don't know if he's ever Animal Crossed, but like I have video evidence that like AOC did play Among Us, right? And I have, I can see that she was understanding it and felt sorry as she like snapped someone's neck and try to figure out like if it was toast or not. And I think one of the most powerful aspects of social media that isn't talked about a lot, in a positive way maybe, is the way that it can help to, when used right, humanize everyone. I feel like social media usually is kind of talked about in the sense of how it does the opposite. I think for people like AOC, right, and like Representative Omar and Lauren Underwood, who's another congresswoman from Illinois, is also really active on Instagram and social media. And I think these younger members younger candidates, even because there are a lot of candidates who are active and who are smart and savvy online. And I think it helps to show that these are people, right? Like, it's like one of the things I remember is AOC when she moved to DC, she had a whole Instagram story about like what was the sound coming from her sink in her new DC apartment, and it was because most apartments in New York City apparently don't have garbage disposals. She had never encountered one in her life, and she like turned it on by accident and was like, "What is happening in my sink?" And it was like a very like genuine, funny, human moment. And I think these are the things that actually can be so powerful about social media, is that like these people in power are just people. And I think so often politicians try to almost like hide that fact and obscure the fact that they are like regular people for some reason. And I think more often than not, the most successful ones are the ones who not only don't hide the fact they're regular people, but just embrace that fact and embrace and acknowledge their faults and their mistakes, right? Like, I think of whenever some bullshit Republican right-wing outlet like published like the video of like AOC dancing like on the roof back in college or whatever, and she like owned that moment. She immediately had like a video of her outside her like congressional office like doing that same dance, and it's like, yeah, like she gets it. Like, she's totally there to like own her embarrassing stories from her past and her quote unquote mistakes and acknowledge it and be like, yeah, I mean, I'm a person. Like, this is, I'm 28 when I was getting like running for office, like 29, 30 now. Like, this is who I am. And I think that is so endearing and something that is so lost from politics in 2020. I feel like people so often, I feel like, want to pretend to not be real people. And I think one of the things that helped to build that powerful connection that President Obama had with the country was the fact that he was someone who was very flawed, right? Like, he'd be the first to admit it. Like, if you ever read Dreams of My Father, which I strongly recommend anyone to read, it's a beautifully written book. Like, he acknowledges his like past with like drug use and his like anger and his frustrations. I mean, the entire book is like his kind of his anger and his rage and his frustrations and his confusion and his depression at just like being a mixed race man in America, and how to reconcile that, and how to reconcile not having a father really in his life. And I think these are things that just help to humanize him more and more and more. And so that when he did speak to us or for us, I think it carried this extra layer of understanding and this extra connection and level of empathy, because we felt like he had also lived a regular person's life, and he had also struggled in a genuine way, and not in the like, I grew up in a log cabin way that like every politician has tried to say since 1860 and Abraham Lincoln. It's like, no, like he actually lived his life, and it was an actual honest autobiography, and not kind of the standard boilerplate ones you get before everybody runs for president. And I think those are the things that help to actually build a connection with the people that you're supposed to be serving, right? And I think that's part of it too, is that whether it's AOC or whether it's Obama, or if you want to go far back, because you have to get the obligatory reference, if you, like to Lincoln, like I think they understood that they are not like the supreme leader of the people that they represent. They are either a congresswoman or the president or the governor or the senator of this area. And they think that it is a incredible honor, right? Like AOC, I think in particular, very much talks about the fact that like 2 years ago, she was a bartender, right? Like, this is what she did, and now she's a member of Congress. And I think she hasn't lost sight of that in such a genuinely powerful way, to where it's like anyone can do this job. And I think she relishes showing that you don't need an Ivy League, and you don't need to be a lawyer, and you don't need to have a rich dad, and you don't need to be a white man to do this job, right? That like you can be someone with a working class background, you can be someone who was a waitress or a bartender or a cook, or any other number of professions that never really get considered as stepping stones onto the path of, privilege and power.
Yeah.
And I think streaming helps show that too.
I think I mean, like anytime somebody tries to attack her on that like bartender or waitress background,
It's so bizarre.
she immediately owns it and says, "Yeah, that makes me way more relatable than you, Mr. Ivy League lawyer. Like more people have had my experience than have had your experience. So I don't know why you are so disconnected that you think that is an attack, that you are attacking anybody else who has had that experience when you attack me." And it's definitely something that does make her, like, she is innately more accessible compared to the elite that is, the lawyers. And I think it also speaks to, if like we can get to that point where there is, a broader diversity of professions that make up the United States House and Senate, and it's not, old white lawyers or something like that. Like maybe we won't have the laws always 15 years behind the technology because they don't understand it. If you get, tech industry giants or tech industry leaders that understand, what's going on behind Google's algorithms or Facebook's algorithms or something, and you can go in there and you can speak to that and you could really try and like drive that activity. Or you can be there and you can immediately shut people down when they try and say games are what are causing, violent behavior or something like that, because you've spent your entire life as a gamer, or playing, in gaming communities, and you can basically immediately shut it down and say, hey, Extra Life brings in this much money every year. Gaming streams, charity streams bring in far more than you think they do. So don't even go down that road of thinking that violence in video games equates to violence in the real world, because it just doesn't, because you don't understand it. You only like understand that soundbite that you've been repeating since 93 or something like that, since Mortal Kombat. Like games have become so much bigger than that, and having somebody like AOC out there kind of that can speak to that, because she is a gamer. She knows League of Legends infinitely more than I do, based on what I've seen kind of online and stuff. Like she can speak to that community, and she can swat that kind of like dismissive attitude down when it comes up, as she has, with the waitressing or the bartending.
I think for me too, Trevor inadvertently stepped on a Logan landmine. The violence in video game thing that like President Trump talked about after the Parkland shooting still just like makes me see red so much, where it's like that's such a intellectually and morally bankrupt argument, and it is just it's so easy to dispatch with the simple fact of, well, you know who else has violent video games? England and Germany and Australia and Canada and all these other countries across the globe, and they don't have a gun problem. They don't have a mass murder problem, right? Like, it's not that video games are dangerous and they lead to people doing dangerous things. It's that they don't have access to weapons of mass destruction in a Walmart like you do in America, right? Like, it's not the video game is violent. It's the fact that, like, they don't have guns nearly as accessible as we do here. Maybe let's tackle that problem. And then after we get rid of all the guns, if there's still shootings in the street, we'll tackle that next problem. But I think there's going to be quite a reduction. You'll be surprised to see what happens when there aren't guns, in terms of gun death. And I think that so often is the kind of argument that I feel like is put forth by kind of more reactionary conservative forces who, whether they try to mock AOC for being, a formerly bartender, whether they try to, in Trump's case, mock like Representative Omar, for example, for being an immigrant, and whether they try to kind of just shoo away any try to kind of honest conversation around gun violence in America by just saying, they played too many violent video games. You're doing yourself a disservice in terms of the eyes of history and the people that you serve, but B, these are real problems that are actually affecting your communities, right? Like, this isn't just some like abstract thing we're talking about here. Like, it has real world impacts and consequences, and you're failing in your most basic aspect of a job of serving and representing these people and ignoring and just pretend like it's not real, right? Like the Trump presidency, I think for a lot of people, certainly I would argue for both of us, but beyond that, has been such a clear divide in terms of just any sort of dog whistle has just been like thrown out, and it's just blatant, fill in the bank thing now, right? Whether it's blatant racism or sexism or xenophobia, Islamophobia, it is just they aren't even trying to pretend like they care anymore. And some might argue that they never really cared that much to begin with, but they at least could pretend. And now I think not only can they not pretend that they care about these causes and these issues and these groups of people seemingly, but now they almost mock you for caring, right? It's almost like it's its own dirty word to try to be like empathetic or caring or understanding, right? And our generation, the millennial generation, right, is one that is the most diverse and the largest and the most progressive in the country right now and ever in terms of the previous two categories. And I think those aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, right? Like as you become a more, multicultural and, get different communities and groups of people and cultures and identities and understandings of society's problems and walks of life into a thing, you're going to naturally become more progressive. You're going to naturally become more liberal because you recognize that A, some groups have faced systemic blocks and injustices against them, but B, that maybe other people have ideas that you didn't think of that are really good ideas, right? Like if you just hang out with a group of people all named Chad and like John View the Fourth, they're probably going to have ideas that probably sound pretty similar to yours if your name is also John or Chad or Todd, right? Like it's when you branch out of this like waspy kind of enclave that has dominated so much of the upper echelons of American life in the last 60, 70, 80, 90 years, right? That I think you begin to see real changes and real things begin to be solved that they couldn't even think of because they were never problems in their communities, right? Like if you never grew up in an area that suffered from these issues, it's hard, not impossible, but harder to understand how to help solve them, how to help tackle them, or where to even begin, right? Like it's the same reason why we have, members of Congress in rural communities who bring forward different issues than members of Congress in giant metropolises, because they represent two different kinds of people who have two very different kinds of qualities of life. In the same way, people who come from, communities that are dominated by peoples of color, or immigrant communities or refugee communities along the border, their experiences and their walks of life are different than Connecticut and different than, wherever else it might be, than Jacksonville, Florida, for example. Like they're not the same. And I think broadening our halls of power to represent that is a powerful thing, right? Like it's going to be obvious to say, but representation matters in both symbolic ways in order to show people what they can achieve and what is possible, but also in real tangential ways in having a more personal understanding of the problems and the issues and the lives of who they represent, right? Like it's that basic.
Yeah, one of the biggest things that I mentioned a little bit before we started recording that has jumped out at me off of the AOC kind of stream is I used to have a much more active passion for politics and engagement in the idea of getting into politics. I joked before we started recording that I'm 35 now, and since high school I had kind of had the idea of like I turned 35 in 2020, so I can run for president in 2020. I should do that. I should go out and, if for nothing else, I'll vote for myself or something and I'll get like one vote. I did not do that. I'm not doing that. Do not vote for me or anything like that. Things are way too important. But like that was that was kind of like a mentality that I had for a number of years that has fluctuated here and there. But when I've looked into it in the past, I've looked into it with the mindset of, okay, if I want to be in politics, I should really look at taking an LSAT and going to law school or something like that. And it's not really until seeing somebody like AOC out there that I can like look at that and be like, no, you know what? Like, there should absolutely be data analysts that are out there, serving in the halls of Congress, because like a data analyst or a data manager like myself is not going to get bogged down by anecdotes that do not paint the full picture of a story. Like, I would absolutely like look at the big picture data of a situation and try and make decisions based on that information, because that's what I've been doing. That is what my career for the last 10 years has pretty much been. And I think that too often, especially, again, like on the right side of the aisle, maybe you see too many people completely ignoring and disregarding what the majority of the information is telling us in favor of these one or two stories from a very isolated pocket of their constituency, or maybe not even their constituency, just like the stories they hear that feed into the narrative that they want to tell. Whereas I would look and say like, hey, this is what the big information and what the studies have shown, so maybe use that as like the informative nature. And I don't need to be a lawyer to be out there making those calls. I don't need to follow that one specific certain path. But it's become so ingrained in kind of our culture that that's just what you do if you want to go be in Congress, or in politics, is you have to go in through the law, because obviously politics deals with the law. And it no longer it is no longer a representative government. It is no longer of the people, by the people, for the people. It is a very specific echelon of people making up 90+%. I feel like I don't know what the actual statistics are off the top of my head, but like I remember seeing that at some point, that like the previous job makeup of your average congressperson or senator is like overwhelmingly they worked as lawyers, and that afforded them the money to run for a campaign, and then also affords them the quote unquote gravitas to take on that position or take on that role. And I again go back to like, we need computer programmers out there that can speak in Congress to the ever-changing dynamic of the technological landscape, so it's not dumbass 80-year-old senators that don't understand how their iPhone works, or are asking a Google representative why something on their iPhone is doing this thing, and the Google representative has to say, well, sir, I don't work for Apple, so I can't answer that question. And they just have such an ignorance to technology. And that's what like the world is today. Like, the fact that we are so far behind the times in that kind of stuff, we need to basically really change the makeup of that, and bring in a different caliber of people, and kind of tying it back to AOC. AOC is absolutely representative of that, and the fact that she is a gamer as well, to tie it to like our actual ecosystem here, I guess. Like the fact that I saw her streaming out there, I have had a lot of active thoughts in the last week of like, what would it look like? What would it take for me to, in 2022 or something like that, look into running for either a local office or something like that? What steps would I have to take, and what kind of, action and what kind of game plan could I put behind that, if that was something I really wanted to try and pursue, and kind of step back into that realm? And that comes from seeing somebody. Obviously, like, she and I have very different backgrounds, of course, but I can still relate to her on we are, younger certainly than the average age of your politicians out there. And we have this thing in common of video games. We have these, communities that we can speak to, and we can, cherish and relish the action and the advocacy that these communities can and do partake in. As it is, like, as we're going through this episode, I'm pretty sure I'm going to just like title this episode "Keep Politics in Gaming,"
Yes,
because fuck anybody who says keep your politics out of gaming. Like, politics exists in every aspect of life, and you wanting to, like, as I was scrolling through Twitter, I saw somebody like just like saying, you know, a couple minutes ago while you were talking, I was kind of looking and see somebody in there saying like, I wish I could mute politics, you know, for the next 5 days or something like that, or 10 days. And I'm like, that idea is coming from such a place of privilege that I just want to smack them in the face. Because not everybody has the luxury of being able to ignore politics and be perfectly fine by doing that. Like, and I recognize that, just as I have for the last 4 years, that as a middle-class white guy, I'm doing just fine under Trump, realistically. Like, yes, I'm technically worse off because of a job change and the fact that I work in the arts, which have been drastically hit right now. But like, in terms of like my rights, I'm not under threat of my rights being taken away or anything like that. And so I have to recognize that from that place of privilege, I should be out there speaking and being an advocate for the people who don't have, you know, that power in the political system and that voice. And that's what, like, kind of, again, going to all of this, like, I've been more philanthropically active this year, and I've always been somebody like who has been, you know, very into philanthropy, again, working in the nonprofit sector myself. Like, I regularly am giving out there and giving, you know, portions of my income to things I am passionate about. But this year has ramped it up, given everything that has been going on this year, and given the fact that, I guess, I mean, there's an element of it. Hey, since I didn't go to a PAX West or something like that, and since I have that extra income that I wouldn't be spending on those trips, I can put that money into something that will maybe hopefully, you know, benefit something greater than myself, in a way that I might have selfishly used that funds for, you know, personal trips or something else in the past. Being locked down has really kind of said, well, I can't do any of that, so yeah, I'm going to give money to Black Lives Matter movements, or I'm going to give money to these political campaigns that I want to support and want to be, you know, more active with, in a way that is reaching levels that I've certainly never reached. And obviously I don't have the means to do as much as I would even like to do, but I'm doing what I can with what I have. And that's another aspect that, like, always gets kind of like thrown down at this generation of people, like the millennial kind of nature. I again, this is one of the reasons, you know, we got very fired up before we started recording, is coming from nonprofit. I've been so tired of in many of my, you know, work settings, being, quote, the token millennial or something like that, being the younger guy on staff, that you know, how do we reach millennials for donations and stuff like that? I'm like, millennials are giving to the things they want to give to, but they're not going to open a fund at a community foundation with a $25,000 minimum, because they don't have the $25,000 minimum that you would require for that. But they will go out and give their, you know, $50 or $100 at a time to initiatives that they care about, or to even funds within a community foundation or something like that, because that's what speaks to them. They're not giving out of a lack of interest in giving. They're actually giving in much higher percentages, you know, compared to other generations. They just don't have as much money to give because of, you know, the fact that we've been hit with 2 recessions in the time that I've, you know, been existing in the workforce. And so, yeah, that's another element of this that really kind of, speaks to me, and that real advocacy that I think AOC in particular kind of really tries to promote, and is out there championing and celebrating when she is out there speaking to, you know, to the media or to her constituency. She's celebrating the fact that the young people are out there doing what they can, and it sucks that they can't do more, and she recognizes that.
I think for me too, it's a trope and a cliche that's so tired and worn out at this point, and so blatantly untrue, in terms of like the millennials just don't care, and they're so self-involved and so only worried about their own kind of self-interest and next slice of avocado toast and, you know, chai, cappuccino, latte.
One of the ones that hit home for me last year was there was a couple days there where, like, a story was making the rounds of, like, these weird single young millennials are going to Disneyland and they're using like their free income as somebody who was doing that on like a semi-regular basis and going out and hanging out with, former That Nerdy Site contributor Ben Bellevue or and friend of the site Lauren Wilson. Like I would go out and hang out with them and we would do Disneyland trips, once or twice a year there. And just because I'm doing that as something for myself doesn't mean that I wasn't also giving to the arts in town or something like that. It's yes, I had the means to take those trips and I'm gonna do that because it's something that helps keep me sane and helps let me connect with friends and something like that, and it's a thing I want to do. Like for the people that chastise that are weirdly going to be the same people that like don't think anybody else should be getting a say in what I do with my money, so why do they suddenly care that I'm using some of that money to go to Disneyland?
Well, and it's also one of why is going to Disneyland with friends as a vacation because something that brings you joy better than buying a, super expensive sports car because you're having a midlife crisis because you're a 50-year-old baby boomer? Like, they're like, each are things that you're doing to treat yourself. I would argue one is a healthier decision than the other. Certainly better in the long-term investment aspect of things. And so I don't know, like our generation is a generation that has been forced to confront a series of massive problems and crises at once. We didn't ask to be the generation that's going to have to really step up and tackle climate change. We didn't ask to be the generation that had to step up and tackle two different global recessions and economic crises. We didn't ask to have to be the generation that grew up in the wake of 9/11 and how that changed the world. This is just how the world was left to us, basically. And we're trying to do what we can. And I think that in the midst of tackling multiple global crises of a scale not seen since the end of the Second World War, if we also want to eat avocado toast or go to Disneyland or play a video game for our own mental sanity, that to me seems like a healthier choice than smoking a pack of cigarettes, for example, or downing a bottle of alcohol, for example, as is kind of the custom in the 1950s or 60s or before. I think we're a generation who our big passions, our big dreams, our big bucket wish list of political priorities are these crazy, selfish, single-minded, only about us priorities like universal health care. They're about expanding access to voting to people who were felons or who couldn't vote before. They're about universal voter registration because voter registration is in itself an insane system that is not necessarily found in other countries. Canada, for example. We're about doing these ludicrous things like trying to bridge the vast chasm of income inequality that exists in America right now. We're trying to very selfishly lift up the 40% of Americans who make under $50,000 in a year, 40% of the country. We're very selfish in these pursuits, and we're very selfish in trying to tackle climate change that will devastate the world, right? Like, I think the number I saw the other day was by the end of the century, if we don't tackle this problem, 3 billion people could be living in regions of the globe that have temperatures that, as of right now, are only found in the Sahara Desert. 3 billion people by the end of the century if we don't fix this. These are our very selfish pursuits that we care about, right? Expanded housing rights, right? Like, I think the notion that we're some sort of selfish, like, non-altruistic generation is just ludicrous on the face of it. And even more so when you look at the actual evidence, right? Like, again, I said it off air, but like, I think the millennial generation is the most optimistic generation I can think of. I also think that we're a sort of weird nihilistic, optimistic Batman-esque version of that, maybe, but only because that's the world that we've grown up in. It's been dark. It's been hard. Right? Like, I was 9 years old when 9/11 happened. That was my introduction basically to the world, right? Like, I obviously can remember when that happened, and it's a clear before and after this moment, as I'm sure Trevor can as well. He had been in high school. Like, you can remember when this happened, and it has impacted essentially our entire adult lives from there in a very similar way. Like, the 2008 financial crisis had a very large before and after this moment thing. So excuse us if we're also a little bit snarky at times, if we're also a little bit quick to mock someone who's being stupid, because this is our world, and it's not gotten that much better in our lifetimes. And again, like, we're the first generation in American history who is projected to make less money than our parents. This has an impact on us. And in spite of all of these negative things, in spite of all of the depressing realities of our world around us, we are still a generation who is marching in the streets for Black Lives Matter and helping to be a massive force for change on gun rights in the wake of the Parkland shooting, where these 16 and 17-year-old kids demanded new laws and demanded representatives who understood the reality situation on there, and flipped, it should be said, the Florida legislature to pass gun restriction laws in place when it was previously the loosest gun law state in the entire country, right? Like, in spite of all of the negative, depressing realities around us, we keep demanding our country actually live up to its founding ideals and be more inclusive and be a better reflection of who we are. And I think, to tie it back to AOC, she is someone who very much embodies that as well, where she demands that her government that she is a part of be held accountable to the people that it represents, right? And she demands that it be called out for its blatant sexism, like when she was accosted on the steps of the literal Congress building itself by a fellow member. Like, this is a generation, I think, that has absolutely zero time for your bullshit. And if you are not helping fix the problems that plague this country, you are part of the problem. And I think that can be harsh and that can be a affront to some people's ears, but it's because we're short on time. There are huge things that are happening very soon that will make the world less good. And so, we're going to be a little bit quick about it.
Yeah, the can has been kicked down the road for too long, and now we're the ones that have to pick it up and actually do something about it.
Yes, and to a final point I'll make too, because a person I follow on Twitter brought this up as well, where there was a 102-year-old woman who went and voted sometime this past week or whatever, and in that she kind of mentioned that her grandmother had been a slave, and they just kind of quote tweeted and said slavery wasn't that long ago, right? Her grandmother was a thing. Like, this is a thing. These scars take time to heal, and it hasn't actually been that long, right? Like, it's not been that long. It's only been 3 generations removed from people being enslaved by giant chunks of the country. And the scars for other groups of people in this country, like Mexican Americans, for example, are even fresher than that. And basically every community in this country that isn't a white straight man. I mean, again,
like the Asian Americans like George Takei that were in the camps after World War II, yeah,
right, or Indian Americans who came in the '60s in the wake of the loosening of the immigration laws, and the issues they've had to face, or the Muslim American community in the wake of 9/11, or the fact that if you were a member of the LGBTQ community, you didn't have a guaranteed right to legally marry who you wanted to until 5 years ago. I mean, we've made a tremendous amount of progress, but also these are things that weren't that long ago at the same time. And I think both you can be inspired and emboldened and feel encouraged by the progress you've made, and also reflect on the fact that these are things that weren't that long ago. George Takei is still alive. I mean, there were still people alive who were imprisoned and put in essentially internment camps for no reason other than just because they were Japanese Americans. These weren't that
we
long
have
ago.
the cages on the border and all that
Yeah.
stuff. That, like, all of these things are on the ballot. All of these things
Mhm.
are things that are under threat as well. Like
Yes.
especially as we are, maybe an hour removed from Amy Coney Barrett being officially confirmed by the Senate, as of recording right now. Like, that drastically changes the potential makeup of the court, like, unless additional action happens, that either expands the bench or adds term limits or all of the above. Like, there is a generation of conservative judges now that have made no, like, qualms about undoing a lot of the things that we're talking about, that will, that are not opposed to undoing the gay marriage ruling from 5 years ago, that are not opposed to undoing Roe versus Wade from the 60s, was it, or the Civil Rights Act. Like, the Civil Rights Act has already been, like, drastically gutted and dismantled in recent years, under Republican watch, and basically Republican missive. So, like, these are not conceptual problems, that are out there. These are real life issues that are happening day in, day out, and need to be accounted for, need to be addressed and resolved.
I think for me, what I would like to briefly kind of conclude on is the fact that it is hard, and I understand that, and it's difficult, and it can seem overwhelming. It can seem like you just have bad news cascading down upon you. And in the wake of that, I would simply say that from the dawn of America, and there's a great New York Times article that if I can find, or if Trevor can find, I will include in the show notes, absolutely. Part of the 1619 project, the Pulitzer Prize winning project that the New York Times did. From the dawn of America, the people who have actually been the most adamant, the most fervent, the most rabid, die-hard supporters of the American dream and the promise and ideals of the American people, who've constantly demanded that this country be held accountable to those ideals that promise every single citizen, have been the groups of this country that have also been oppressed. It have been the groups of this country who did not start out with those rights. From the very beginning of this country, African Americans have fought in every single war in this country's history and demanded that their rights be met. And the same has been true for every subsequent group of people that have come to this country with the same belief in its ideals and its dream that all people are created equal, that anyone that comes here can make something new and get a new start and build something better than what they previously had. That this is a place, that this is a home of a multicultural, pluralistic, liberal society that relishes the fact that it is almost uniquely a universal nation. And it has been those groups of people and groups and communities that have constantly not had those rights afforded to them that have most made the biggest strides and the most progress within this country and its history. It has not been the Anglo-Saxon white community that has done most of that and that has made the huge strides the country has made since 1776. That has not been the case. It has been the people who've had their rights denied, that if anyone should have given up, that if anyone should have said, well, it's not even worth it, would have been understandable, would have been totally within their rights to do so, that have most been the most fervent in making this country a more perfect union. And that's what I would say. That's what inspires me every day. That's what makes me wake up every day saying that we can make a difference, right? Like, as Trevor said, there are very real things on the ballot this November. It is not an abstract conversation. Who we are and what we represent is on the line. And I think that makes it even more imperative to vote, and to vote for people who represent the best of what we can aspire to be, and strongly advocate for the rights and protections of all people in this country, I think. And if you have any sort of questions or doubts or worries or think your vote won't matter, I can very much assure you that it does. It matters a great deal. Elections in this country have been decided by literally one vote before, on a local level and state level, and even nationally. You will be surprised by the amount of 1 or 2 votes here or there that shift districts, that shift counties, that shift states, that then shift a federal election. Your vote matters a lot. It is a powerful instrument, and I would also say it is just one of the tools you have, right? Like, nobody is saying vote and then don't do anything again for 2 years. Vote and use your voice and use the tools that you have at your disposal to be in the streets and to write your members of Congress and to sound off everyday citizen. Being a engaged citizen of this country is not a job you have one day every 2 years. It is a thing that you are in the trenches for every day, to push and demand and to make this country better.
Hear, hear.
Anyway, that is going to be the show. As I said, the show notes this week, me and Trevor will compile a few different articles, I think, that we encourage all of our listeners to read. Whenever this episode goes live, we'll also have a Twitter thread probably on the articles that me and Trevor each pull in, because I think it's a very important topic. But that is the show. You can go find That Nerdy Site over at patreon.com/thatnerdysite if you'd like to support what you just heard, like all of our wonderful patrons have, and we appreciate their support tremendously. They help keep the lights on, and they literally make this show happen. And so I appreciate that tremendously. Again, you can go find that over at patreon.com/thatnerdysite. Check out all of the tiers. Check out all of the goals. They may be changing soon, as That Nerdy Site is in its last week before it celebrates its anniversary. So stay tuned on news for that, I'm sure, in the coming days and weeks. You can also go support us by subscribing and sharing with your friends on podcast services around the globe. iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, other things, probably, I don't know, that's Trevor's job, but make sure you go subscribe there. Make sure you go like, make sure you go tell your friends, and help spread the word. It means a lot to us, and we really greatly appreciate it. And then I would also say, if you could leave us a review on iTunes, rate us, give us 5 stars. That also means the world to us, and especially for newer-ish shows. We're 26 episodes in, so, as well. Otherwise, you can go find Trevor Starkey at Trevor J. Starkey online. Anything that you want to say or shout out one last time, Trev?
Shout out to, it'll be going live to everybody this week if you're not one of our Patreon supporters already. But you can go check out the big, crazy, in-depth 4.5-hour rundown that me, Brandon, Gan, Cameron, and Frank do of PlayStation 4 exclusives, and kind of running through that bracket. That'll go live on Halloween Day for everybody. And it's been kind of the monthly early access episode of That Nerdy Site show for the month of October here for our Patreon supporters. But yeah, go check that out when it goes live if you haven't already. It'll put you in the mood for all of the cool next-gen PS5 stuff.
Here, I agree. You can go find me at Lefty Logie, Loggy, on Twitter. I will also plug that out. I will also shout out a Patreon exclusive podcast me and Trevor recorded as of recording this yesterday, that will go live also on Halloween.
On Halloween, yeah.
For Patreon patrons, where we kind of went over the best and worst TV series finales of all time. That will go live at the end of November for everyone. It was, I thought, a really fun conversation, and it's always fun to talk about some things we didn't like as much, but also a lot of things we actually ended up really liking. And it's always good to kind of sit down and have a nice long chat about fun things with Trev. So I'd urge everyone to go check that out. You can go find That Nerdy Site at That Nerdy Site all across the internet. And until next time, play your games, be good to each other, and vote.